if you haven't got an operational practice that is agile, that wants to test and learn, that wants to be able to actually understand and measure, then it's going to be very difficult to then adapt and observe those changes, generating the outcome that you actually want. And that, to me, is the missing jigsaw piece that I see too often, is that a lot of our conversation in our industry is around how wonderful the technology is. And by the way, it is, but it needs to be balanced with, and how do we get to exploit it? And what needs to be true about our culture, our practices, our operations? Because frankly, unless those are in place, then the rocket's not going to get very far off the ground, to use that sort of metaphor.
Welcome to Talk Time with MaxContact, your go-to podcast for everything contact center related. Join us as we dive into the incredible world of contact centers and explore the latest trends, innovative strategies, and cutting-edge technologies that are reshaping customer interactions. In each episode, we're joined by industry experts to share their practical insights and advice to elevate your contact center performance. Whether you're looking to enhance operational efficiency, improve team management, or understand the impact of AI in contact centers, you're in the right place.
Welcome to another episode of Talk Time with MaxContact. I'm your host, Sean McIver. In this episode, we're joined by Paul, the Contact Centre Innovator, Weald, who's the director of MCX, the independent consulting business, helping organizations deliver the best contact centre experience they can. He's a successful angel investor as well, investing in 6 startups in the past 8 years, including 2 customer management businesses, 2 e-commerce, and 2 healthcare businesses. Paul, I always like to do a short introduction before I hand over to the guest themselves. Did I miss anything there?
No, Sean, and welcome everybody. I hope you find this useful and take something away from our conversation today. So the background is 30 years in the contact center industry, across technology businesses, across consultancy, more projects than I care to remember in terms of actually implementing improvements. And then that's morphed, as you said, now into being involved in startup businesses. And that's where my kind of latest passion is.
So with that as the framing for what we're going to talk around today, which is going to cover a couple of different areas, I want to start off with a really broad question, and that's around the definition or the identification of an excellent contact center experience for the customer. Now, as you say, you've touched many different business verticals, many different business areas. What does that mean to you?
It's an interesting question in terms of what does excellent mean? And it doesn't always mean the same thing to every organization. Sometimes just being good enough is sufficient. Some organizations want to set the bar really high in terms of delighting customers, and then they will go an extra mile and try and do more. But at its foundations and its fundamentals, it's actually about balancing supply and demand and actually making sure that customers get the information available to them through a means that is appropriate, and actually the organization is able to deliver that at an optimum cost to serve.
It's interesting you talk about the balance that needs to be struck around supply and demand. We're in a post-event world now. We had a seismic change in the entire business landscape. And we are in an environment now whereby supply and demand is very different, because you've got customers who are working in a hybrid world at the moment. Indeed, myself, I've made several calls in preparation for moving home recently, and I've been able to make them between other areas of work that I've been doing. In terms of the innovation side of things and how you achieve that balance, for a lot of people, when you don't know what your incoming traffic or what your outgoing contact rate is going to be, where do you start with ensuring that you can still deliver on that customer expectation?
I think you start by doing some analysis of what that demand is, and putting my consulting hat on. The way that I would typically do this is, and again, contact centers are highly metricated environments, and I'm sure we'll kind of get to talk about that later. But basically start by understanding what those customer intents are, and actually what the value to the customer is of that interaction versus the value to the organization. And you can very simply think of it as a kind of 2x2 matrix. So those things that are highly valuable to the customer and highly valuable to the organization, guess what? That's what you want your contact center agents to be focused on. At the other end of the spectrum, so the low value to the organization, low value to the customer, that's your failure demand. So that's where your business improvement teams want to focus elsewhere, often elsewhere in the organization. What's the root cause of why this is happening? And then work through some improvement practices to take it away. And then what's interesting is where it's high value to the customer and it's lower value to the organization, that's definitely something that automation and self-serve and generative AI, making those practices more proficient, has a role to play. And then those that are high value to the organization, but lower value to the customer. So if it's regulated industries, it might then be things like compliance and terms and conditions. You just need to find a way to simplify that because you want to make it lower customer effort. So once you begin to understand where your intents are against that matrix, you can then start to think about what is it that we need to do to kind of make it better. And then the supply and demand aspect is, yes, once you've done all the good self-serve things, you're still going to have potentially more demand than you can cope with. So are there then other ways that you can bring on additional resources? So one of the businesses I was involved in a number of years ago was in the area of kind of gig CX, and think of this as like an on-demand workforce. So it's valued by the customer because it's peer-to-peer, but actually you can apply that from a resource management perspective pretty much around the exceptional situations. So your kind of surge and spike moments, that's where a lot of the really good case studies are for that sort of resource time.
You've made the critical error here, Paul, by mentioning generative AI. So I'm going to dive straight into that. Again, you have a wealth of experience and, you've emphasized the importance of operational innovation to enable generative AI within contact centers. Can you give me a specific case where doing that has transformed the customer experience? What were the key challenges? How were those overcome? The framing for that, I think, is that a lot of people are aware of generative AI. There's a mismatch between the art of the possible and the art of the practically implementable, if you like.
The piece, Sean, that I take most interest in is not the technology. I'll leave that to your organizations. You're really, really good at it. It's actually how can it be exploited? And that's then how does the operation need to change? How does it need to become more agile, more sort of innovative? And if we take one example, which I think is something of a kind of game changer, that's the fact that these days the technology can actually, the analytics can apply to 100% of the interactions that are going on in the sort of contact center. So you can have transcriptions, you can have summaries, you can have intent classification, you can have prompts and nudges to the agent around next best action. That's all marvelous. However, if you haven't got an operational practice that is agile, that wants to test and learn, that wants to be able to actually understand and measure, then it's going to be very difficult to then adapt and observe those changes, generating the outcome that you actually want. And that, to me, is the missing jigsaw piece that I see too often, is that a lot of our conversation in our industry is around how wonderful the technology is. And by the way, it is, but it needs to be balanced with, and how do we get to exploit it? And what needs to be true about our culture, our practices, our operations? Because frankly, unless those are in place, then the rocket's not going to get very far off the ground, to use that sort of metaphor.
Just expanding this out a little, because you mentioned gig CX, and that's an area that I think is really interesting. But with a focus on technology such as Gen AI and also gig CX, how do you balance the technological advances with, what is essentially an irreplaceable human element in customer service, particularly if we think about some of the complex, emotional or high-stakes service scenarios? I think we would both agree there are areas where, or I certainly feel like there are areas where AI simply can't compete yet. How do you strike that balance?
Fairly recently, there's been some, I would argue, misinformed opinion pieces around AI is going to take all the contact center jobs away within, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. And I understand, and it's come from some quite well-known people in the kind of business world. And I kind of understand that if you want, from a PR perspective, to make a noise and generate some interest, then that's one way of doing it. But I think what that misses is actually the landscape that goes on inside organizations. And I had a fairly recent example where my wife decided that we could rationalize our home package for things like broadband and landline and kind of so on and so forth. And she ended up having a 30-minute conversation with a contact center agent where it was quite clear that it was quite painful for the contact center agent to navigate between different systems. With that provider, they acquired a competitor, but they still had different systems. They wanted to move from one to the other. It was as if you were moving organizations, but you kind of weren't. And there were 3 or 4 things that she wanted to do. And part of the backdrop to this was price rises, and April of 24, the tariffs had all gone up. And at the end of that conversation, it took half an hour. I think that agent had helped my wife save about 20 to 25% of our annual monthly cost for those services. Now, you might argue that in the ideal world, AI could have done that. But I can assure you from the conversation that my wife had, that the way the agent was almost hamstrung to actually have to go into out these different systems, put the customer on hold, come back and confirm that it had been done. I mean, it all was seamlessly done by the agent, but it's not that AI can't do it. It's that the environment in terms of systems and processes, and particularly where there's a legacy of organizations and mergers and acquisitions, it's just not going to work in the way that everyone would kind of like it to.
I think that's a really good example to give. And it strikes me as something that I've heard several times, and I believe myself. And that's even going back to 5-10 years ago, when there was a lot of conversations around RPA, robotic process automation. And the founding principle of that is, if you've got a standard process that has all of the escape points well documented and defined, that is prime for automation. Anything that involves much more fluid responses, where it can be much more dynamic, is far less appropriate for automation, or it's a lot harder to do automation. And it feels a little bit like a similar sort of scenario when it comes to the more recent developments in Gen AI. I think where you can say, here's the flow that you need to do in these scenarios, that makes sense. I think as soon as you get into those, as you say, cross-system events that are complex, whereby you're needing to consider a number of factors, I think that's not impossible, but a lot harder to do. Just to circle back as well for a moment, you talked about that metrication, it's well metricated industry. From your article on operational innovation that I read, you highlighted the importance of metrics and reporting as governance mechanisms. Through the lens of contact centers, which metrics do you find kind of are most indicative of genuine improvement in customer experience? And if you can elaborate on why specifically those.
A wise person said to me once, there's no such thing as a bad metric, but there's definitely bad application of metrics. So I think that is the nuance. And there's lots of different ways that we can measure financial performance, things like cost to serve, commercial performance, which might be contact resolution rates, it might be conversion rates, operational metrics in terms of capacity management, utilization, the dreaded average handle time. Yes, it has a role to play from a resource management perspective. And then customer metrics. And a lot of the customer metrics, if it's NPS or CSAT, you start by actually surveying customers. And as soon as you do that, you are at risk of introducing bias. Because if you don't get a representative set of people at a point in time giving you an answer, what you're then basing as a data point is actually invalid. And also, if you're chasing particular commercial metrics, I can certainly think back to a catalog company where the initiative was around getting agents to cross-sell and upsell, and they did it really well until they found 3 months later, the unintended consequence was the customer return rate had actually gone up significantly. So you can focus on a metric But you have to also look left and right, and you also have to challenge yourself to say, is this data point reliable?
So if you've got a data point and it is a reliable data point and it is a valuable data point, one of the things that I've seen in certain environments across a number of different contact centers throughout my career is that there is a risk that the metric itself becomes a tick box exercise. Are we hitting X? Yes, no. If no, shout at people until it improves. That's a very broad generalization, a massive oversimplification, but I think the story's there. So to follow up on that, how do you ensure that these metrics, once you've determined them, don't just become targets to hit, but actually reflect actual indication of customer satisfaction and therefore operational effectiveness?
You need to ask yourself the question around, are these metrics going to win the hearts and minds of your contact center staff? Some things will and some things won't. So the best example I have of that was a few years ago. I had a stint running a contact center for a global airline. And the issue when I came into the business was that the previous year, the abandon call rate had been something north of 20%, which for this organization, which was a very well-known customer-facing organization, was not good at all. And basically what we worked through over the course of 9 months was we brought that metric down to acceptable levels. 5% was the kind of level. And we did it by a series of marginal gains, and we can talk about some of those things in a sort of moment. But in terms of hearts and minds, every single member of staff got why we were actually making changes. We were making changes because it wasn't acceptable that a fifth of customers, when they wanted to contact us, weren't able to do so. And it suddenly became a kind of cultural element that this is what we were all rowing together to do. And then when we started to report upwards as to how we were doing against a recovery plan, and we had monthly targets, so it was a fixation. But actually, as people saw that was beginning to improve, they all believed that they were part of that outcome. And they were more motivated, and more ideas came forward from the front line about, could we try this, could we do that, which was where some of the marginal gains came from. So I think the acid test is, does this metric make sense not only for the customer, but will our staff help us to kind of get there?
Hope you're enjoying the conversation so far. If you're finding it valuable, we've got something special for you. Check out our latest industry report, a free resource filled with data-driven insights directly from the contact center landscape, created for contact center leaders looking to stay ahead of the curve. Find out more information via the link in this episode's resources.
I'm going to just unpack a little further on what you've just said around the marginal gains. You've applied this concept to contact center operations, and just to elaborate on that, that's small incremental improvements leading to significant benefits, kind of almost the aggregation of small minor improvements. Can you just outline an example of that? Because I was trying to think about it myself, and I've heard an analogy of, if someone handed you a bike and said, make this bike 10% better, that's a huge ask. If someone handed you a bike and said, make this bike 1% better 10 times, very different story. So again, just for kind of the benefit of contextualizing that.
Yeah, it is. So those stories come from British cycling. So Delves Brailsford, also Clive Woodward, who was the England rugby coach 20 years ago when England won the Rugby World Cup. I think they'd refer to it as the 101%. So even more than 10. But the point is that it's the continued evolution of doing a better job, a brick at a time, a small incremental improvement at a time, that gets you to a place where you can become excellent. And in elite sports, that is being best in the world, winning Olympic medals, winning kind of World Cups. So if I go back to my airline, where we were trying to reduce the abandoned call rate, we did know that we were under-resourced, so we had to recruit some additional people. But we got more benefit out of actually improving the operation. So we didn't have any kind of technology change. And some of it's counterintuitive. You just have to have a curious mind and try things out. And the story I'll tell is, in an airline contact center, you broadly have two different skill types. You have a sales skill, more orientated around helping customers to plan their journey and make a booking, or you have a service skill. And what we tried out was some changes to call routing. So the way the call routing worked was that in the IVR, the customer would identify whether their inquiry was more orientated to sales or service. And we used to route sales calls to a primary sales skill and service call to a primary service skill. But if after a certain amount of time queuing, the call hadn't been answered, we then basically broadened that out and we would then look for a secondary skill. And our test was what happens to the abandoned call rate and performance if we increase the queuing time before the overflow kicks in. And what we found, which we didn't believe when we first saw it, was that the longer we could keep people queuing for a primary skill, the better the performance was. And we thought, as your frown shows, it was counterintuitive. So we then said, right, well, now let's look at the data. So we looked at where calls were being answered, sales skills to sales calls, and those that's kind of overflow. And what we found, and what data told us, was that if a service call overflowed to a sales agent, the sales agent had slightly lower first contact resolution, but they were good, but their handle time went up quite significantly. And vice versa was, if a sales call ended up with a service agent, the conversion rate was slightly lower and the handle time was significantly higher. So what was happening was when we were overflowing lots of calls, they were taking much longer to actually be handled. And the first contact resolution rate wasn't as high, so more people were kind of calling back. So as soon as we started saying to resource management, this was when we were getting closer to our kind of equilibrium steady state, we really focused on making sure that we get calls going to the right place. We knew we would have a sustainable operation. So it started out as a marginal gain. What can we do with changing queuing times? But what we actually uncovered was a root cause DNA that we would never, ever have sort of expected.
That's really interesting. And again, initially my poker face failed completely as you were describing that. And I kind of screwed up my face going, that makes no sense. But actually on reflection, no, that does make sense, even logically. But it's not until you have the curiosity to interrogate those particular aspects and go, what if? So that makes perfect sense. As part of that curiosity and that experimentation, you've mentioned the use of agile multidisciplinary teams that kind of defy organizational boundaries. Again, for those unaware, agile is a particular methodology that's more common in like sort of software development. What are some of the common internal barriers you encounter when introducing things that are alien or transformative in established contact centers? How do you recommend that they be addressed for people listening who are like, okay, that sounds interesting. Yeah, let's put a cross-dimensional team together.
I learned most about agile working on an insurance project, and it was basically introducing a new proposition. And I was heading up the kind of embryonic customer service team. So in the technology development parlance, I was the kind of product owner for customer support. And this was pre-COVID, so everyone was in the office. And we were doing things in an agile way, which means you do the kind of next most important bits to move something to the next stage. And a lot of it was based on face-to-face meetings, often beginning and end of the day, in order, what are the things that we have to do today? And again, this is going to sound in this day and age so counterintuitive, but one of the things we did, because everyone was in the office 5 days a week, was we basically said no one on the project team is allowed to send an email to anybody else on the project team during office hours. So basically, we forced people to go and have a conversation. And, it was a wonderful office. It was all to do with having lots of little spaces where you could have ad hoc meetings. And guess what? We could measure the fact that every day we did the most important things. And over the course of the week, we got much, much closer to where we wanted to be. And it became organic. It just started to happen. And that's what agile is in an organizational sense. And if we're going to, as contact centers, take advantage of all of these great things like generative AI, as we were talking about earlier, you have to be prepared to change the culture. And I don't know quite how we do that in like a hybrid working environment. Yes, I got very good at Miro boards during facilitating workshops during COVID. I need to dust off some of those skills to be able to run these sort of ad hoc meetings and workshops and collaboration sessions when people are actually, not in the office together. But that's what you have to go to. You have to be prepared to try and do things differently.
Just to riff on that a little and kind of explore that slightly further, within any organization, you've got a diverse range of people, personality types, personas, roles, responsibilities. And I can imagine that saying to a collective of any group of individuals, no emails internally, you have to go and talk to them. How do you overcome the resistance to some of these sorts of changes? Because inevitably there'll be people who will just put the brakes on, not want to do it. How do you overcome that hurdle?
I think you have to recognize, therefore, that, you need to make yourself accessible. So there were certain teams that needed my attention as the product owner. And I used to basically say, here are some 1 hour slots in my diary. It will say I'm busy, but I'm not. What I've done is I've protected some time, and whatever you want to come and if you don't need it, it's great because there's other stuff I can be doing. But if you do need me, help yourself.
That's a really interesting way to approach it. I like that a lot. I'm going to switch track a little here because I don't want to have a conversation with you without touching on this, because I think you've got a perspective that we haven't had previously. So different hat going on here. As an angel investor, you backed several startups focused on enhancing customer interactions. As an angel investor in that process, what key factors are you looking for in those startups when determining that decision to invest? Particularly those proposing new solutions for contact centers. So you're looking, for example, at scalability of these innovations or integrating with existing technology. What are some of the benchmarks and metrics that you look for?
It is a completely different paradigm, Sean. So you're kind of right to say I am switching hats. So firstly, for me, it needs to be an innovative idea. So it needs to be something that is kind of sort of disruptive. I'll tell one quick story here. So I've got a theme now around not just contact center improvements. It's actually about behavior change of customers. That's something now that runs through a number of the investments that I've actually made. So I've got really good at apps that change behaviors, whether that is health tech, sustainability. The latest one that is launching this month is about fraud prevention and sort of cybercrime, etc. However, the story is, so I was sitting in a Friday lunch and learn session, and a guy called James Walker joined that session, and he was then running a business called Resolver. So this was at the time of sort of PPI, where there were lots of claims management activities. And basically what James had done was he completely turned that industry upside down by saying, if we provided a free service to customers that made it simpler for them to complain, and then we helped the organizations that were being complained about, we gave them an analytics and insight that would help them improve their complaint management processes. How might that work? And basically, he created a business that was digital and was truly disruptive. And I was sitting in the audience, Sean, thinking, why didn't I meet you 3 years ago? Because I would love to have invested in that business. Anyway, fast forward to the pandemic. James has exited from Resolver, and I'm curious to know what he's doing next. And the business he set up is now the UK's #1 cashback money saving app. Now, he's got, or we collectively have got very lucky because the cost of living crisis came along post-pandemic, and that has actually, or post the Ukraine war, etc., and that has caused a need, almost a perfect storm of, we had an app, we had a product, we had a really good management team, and suddenly there was a kind of customer need. So that's an example, where it's very likely to have a sort of happy ending for you for all sort of concerned.
That's incredible. And really interesting that there was that switch and the fortuitous nature in which that then panned out. It's interesting to hear. There's only time for another couple of questions. So I'm going to take kind of a 20,000 helicopter view here and looking ahead with balancing all of the hats on top of one another all at once. Looking ahead at the industry, what do you see as the next big innovation in contact center technology or practices? How can contact centers prepare for those and capitalize on these upcoming future trends to make sure they're competitive and to retain that customer satisfaction or elevate that customer satisfaction? Whether that's technologies, methodologies emerging on the horizon, or redefining something else within the contact center operation space in, say, the next 5 years.
If we go back 25 years to when the industry really properly started, I know there have been several technological changes along the way. But as we were saying earlier, the fundamentals are still about balancing sort of supply and demand and being able to optimize resolving the customer's query to the best way possible at a kind of optimal cost point. Those things I don't think have changed over the years. I've done more cost optimization projects than I've, prefer to sort of remember. It's always been a sort of perennial management requirement. So I think rather than saying, I think the future is going to be shaped by one particular trend, I think any organization in the future just needs to accept that change is going to happen and it's going to continue to happen, and you should never be standing still. And all the time you can be thinking about those marginal gains, the next 1% that you can make, to use your sort of metaphor for it. That's a great place to be, because you'll always be striving for the sort of next level that you can get to. And I think that's perhaps, if we look back at the impact of the pandemic, I certainly remember in the spring of 2020, the number of, when I was doing a world work for Deloitte at the time, and the number of very major organizations that kind of got proverbially caught with their pants down because they didn't have an ability for contact center agents to work from home. And I certainly saw in the next 6 months, probably more change implemented effectively than I'd seen in the previous number of years, because suddenly there was this immediate pressing need and everybody got behind why it had to happen, so therefore they had the North Star. So I hope we don't have to go through another pandemic. I hope we don't have to go through impact of global wars, etc. But I do think that organizations that continually say they're curious, what can I be doing slightly better? And staff that want to be focused on things that make things better for the customer. That's always a good kind of North Star. I think that would definitely be a recipe for sort of success.
Amazing. Thank you. Last question. And I'm going to apologize in advance, but also not apologize at all. I'm going to kind of ground this a little. One of the things that always strikes me is that we learn our biggest lessons from our greatest mistakes. Going to ask you to tell me about what you do when things go catastrophically wrong. And that feels unfair on one sense, because I'm asking you at the very last bit to tell me about something that went wrong. But I think it's important because we need to acknowledge when things go wrong, and we need to look at those and have an honest assessment and really understand why, because that's where the lessons are. So with that framing, what do you do when things go horrifically wrong, Paul?
Okay, so story of a project, and to protect the innocent, I won't mention the particular client. But so the scenario was that they wanted to change their CRM platform. They wanted to do it in an agile way. It had been very well planned out. There were going to be 5 iterative releases. And by the time the project had played through, there'd be something like a 10% capacity reduction. So in terms of the framing of the project, that was all very, very sound. The point that I came in, the first release had been implemented. The finance team had reduced the budget by 10%. And guess what? The workload was significantly higher than 90% of availability could handle, and there were massive backlogs. It suddenly then turned into firefighting about how do you try and bring these backlogs down. And what they decided to do, because the project was actually running to be more expensive than had first been envisaged, was they stopped the technology development after the 3rd iteration, rather than going through to implement the full 5. And guess what? When you looked at releases 4 and 5, that was where all of the real benefits came from. So unfortunately, the customer service director lost her job, which I think was sad and was avoidable. And that organization took about 2 years to get back to a steady state post the CRM system being changed. And what I now say, as to tell that anecdote, is I think, so when we're talking about agile, the phrase MVP is used, so minimum viable product. I think MVP should be scratched from the lexicon and replaced with MLP, minimum lovable product. So if we only ever did something that customers will use, you won't have that situation that I have just described.
I love that phrase. I'm absolutely stealing that and claiming it as my own.
You're very welcome, Sean.
What an incredible thing to end on. Paul Weald, Director of Multichannel Customer Experience Limited. Thank you ever so much for your time today. What an incredible conversation it's been. Hopefully everyone at home has listened and enjoyed what we've been discussing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And you can find me on LinkedIn as the Contact Centre Innovator.
Incredible. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Talk Time with MaxContact. We hope today's discussion has sparked new ideas to help you advance in your contact centre. To learn more about any of the topics discussed in this episode, visit www.maxcontact.com. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to leave us a rating on your favourite streaming platform to help other like-minded individuals join the conversation. Also, stay tuned for our upcoming listener questions segment. We'd love for you to participate and share your thoughts. And remember to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss a future episode. On behalf of everyone at MaxContact, thanks for listening.